spit on her in the morning. By nightfall, she was saving their children's lives. In a brutal Viking settlement where beauty determined worth and deformity meant divine punishment, one woman lived as less than a slave, despite being the most skilled healer on the Norwegian coast. Every life she saved earned her nothing but more hatred. Every cure she provided was met with curses. She existed in a hell where she was simultaneously essential and despised, wanted only when death came knocking. Then erased the moment crisis passed. But when a foreign merchant arrived and did the unthinkable, treating her with respect in front of everyone, the settlement's carefully maintained cruelty began to crack. He saw brilliance where they saw corruption. He offered her escape where they offered only endless suffering. And as tensions exploded and the Jarl's pregnant wife fell deathly ill, this broken healer faced an impossible choice that would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of everyone who'd ever made her wish she'd never been born. Because the woman they called cursed held all their lives in her scarred hands. And for the first time in 24 years of torment, she had the power to decide who lived and who didn't. The woman saving the child's life had been spit on 3 times that morning. Yrsa's hands moved with absolute certainty across the boy's fevered skin, pressing here, listening there, her fingers reading his body like runes only she could interpret. The child's mother stood 2 steps back, far enough that their shadows wouldn't touch, close enough to watch her son's chest rise and fall in labored gasps. The longhouse reeked of sickness and fear, thick smoke from the central fire doing nothing to mask the sour smell of sweat and bile. "His lungs are filling," Yrsa said, her voice steady despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. She didn't look up. Looking up meant seeing the mother's face twist in that familiar expression. Disgust. Fighting with desperate need. "I can drain the fluid, but you must hold him still. It will hurt." The mother's silence stretched like a rope pulled taut. Yrsa felt it in her shoulders, that old familiar tension, the weight of being simultaneously essential and repulsive. Outside, the late autumn wind howled off the Norwegian fjord, rattling the wooden walls, carrying with it the salt-sharp promise of the brutal winter ahead. "Will you let your son drown in his own body?" Yrsa asked, still not raising her eyes. "Or will you let the marked woman save him?" She hated the words even as they left her mouth. Hated how her deformed lip shaped them differently than other women's lips shaped words. Hated that she had to ask permission to do what everyone knew she could do better than anyone else in the settlement. The split in her upper lip, severe and twisted since birth, had marked her as rejected by the gods themselves. 24 years of living with a face that made people look away, cross themselves, whisper prayers of protection. 24 years of being the most skilled healer on the coast and being treated like contaminated meat. The mother finally moved, grabbing her son's shoulders with trembling hands. Yrsa pulled her bronze needle from the leather pouch at her belt, held it briefly in the fire's flame, and then made the careful incision between the boy's ribs. The child screamed. His mother's grip stayed iron strong, but Yrsa saw her face turn away, eyes squeezed shut, as if witnessing what the healer's marked hands were doing might curse her too. Fluid drained into the clay bowl. The boy's breathing eased almost immediately. Color returned to his lips. In perhaps 10 heartbeats, the child who had been drowning inside himself was gasping in full, clean breaths. Yrsa packed the wound with honey and clean linen, bound it tight, and stood. Her knees cracked. She'd been kneeling on the packed earth floor for what felt like hours. "He'll live," she said, gathering her tools. "Keep the wound clean. Change the dressing twice daily. If fever returns—" "I know where to find you," the mother interrupted, her voice flat. She still wasn't looking at Yrsa, was already turning toward her son, blocking him from view as if Yrsa might contaminate him further just by standing there. No thanks, there never was. Thanks would require acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would require seeing Yrsa as something other than a necessary evil, a tool to be used and then shoved back into the corner. Yrsa stepped out into the biting wind, pulling her cloak tight. The settlement of Ravnsfjord spread before her in all its gray-brown bleakness. Longhouses squatted like sleeping beasts along the curved shore. Fishing nets hung like spider webs between posts. Smoke rose from a dozen fires, carrying the smell of salted fish and barley porridge. 3 women stood near the well. When they saw Yrsa emerge, they turned away, but not before Eldred, the Jarl's wife, made a gesture with her fingers, an old sign meant to ward off evil spirits. The other 2 followed suit, their hands moving in quick, practiced motions. Then they gathered their water buckets and walked in the opposite direction, even though it meant taking the long path back to their homes. Yrsa's chest tightened. She forced herself to breathe slowly, evenly, the way she'd taught herself years ago. Don't let them see it hurt. Don't give them that satisfaction. She walked toward her own small dwelling, set apart from the others at the settlement's edge, near where the forest pressed close and the shadows grew long even at midday. Past the Jarl's hall, where men's voices rose in argument. Past the storage houses where thralls loaded grain onto carts. Past everything that mattered in Ravensfjord, because she mattered least of all. A rock hit her shoulder blade, not large enough to truly injure, just large enough to sting, to remind, to establish hierarchy. She didn't turn around. Didn't need to. She knew the sound of Torvald's laughter, the Jarl's youngest son, barely 14 but already fluent in cruelty. His friend's snickers joined his, a chorus of casual hatred. "Crooked mouth," one of them called. "Did you curse another child today?" Yrsa kept walking. Her shoulder throbbed. She'd have a bruise by nightfall. Another rock hit the small of her back. This time she stumbled, caught herself, kept moving. Her eyes burned, but she would not cry. Had not cried where they could see since she was 9 years old, since the day she'd realized tears only made them hunger for more. "My mother says you're why the fishing's been poor," Torvald shouted. "Says the gods won't bless our nets while you're still here." The fishing had been poor because they'd overfished the near waters and refused to sail farther out, but Yrsa had learned years ago that truth meant nothing against superstition. She reached her small house, little more than a shed really, and pushed through. The door. Inside, dried herbs hung from the low rafters, filling the space with the mingled scents of sage and thyme and yarrow. Her workspace, her sanctuary, the only place in all of Ravensfjord where she could breathe without feeling judged. But tonight, even here, the walls felt too close. Yrsa sank onto her sleeping bench, finally allowing her shoulders to shake. Not with sobs, she wouldn't give them that, but with the exhaustion of carrying hatred that wasn't hers, but had become her burden. Anyway, her fingers traced the split in her lip, that familiar ridge of scar tissue and malformed flesh that had defined her entire existence. Outside, the wind carried voices from the Jarl's hall, laughter, music, the sounds of people who belonged. Yrsa belonged nowhere, was wanted nowhere, except when death came knocking, and then suddenly everyone remembered where the marked woman lived. The sickness came with the first snow. It started in the thrall quarters, which meant nobody cared until it spread to the Jarl's hall 3 days later. By then, 5 people were already dead, their bodies wrapped in cloth and burned before the ground froze too hard for proper burial rites. Yrsa had warned them, had told the settlement leaders that the waste pit was too close to the stream they drew drinking water from, that the autumn rains had contaminated everything downstream. They'd listened to her warnings the way people listen to crows cawing, noise to be ignored. Now the noise was screaming. Yrsa stood in the doorway of the Jarl's hall, her medicine bag heavy against her hip, watching chaos unfold in the smoky interior. Men and women lay on sleeping benches, curled on the floor, some crying out, others ominously silent. The smell hit her like a fist. Vomit, excrement, unwashed bodies, and underneath it all, the sweet, sick odor of death starting its work. Gudrun, the Jarl's wife, stood in the center of the hall, one hand pressed protectively against her swollen belly. 7 months, pregnant and radiating fury instead of fear. Her eyes found Yrsa and narrowed. "This is your doing," Gudrun said, her voice cutting through the groans and weeping. She was a tall woman, broad-shouldered, with hair the color of honey and a face that men composed poems about. Everything Yrsa wasn't. Your presence has angered the gods. This pestilence is their punishment. Yrsa's jaw tightened. She'd expected this, always expected this. When crops failed, when storms came, when anything went. Wrong, the marked woman was the convenient answer. This is bad water and human waste, Yrsa replied, keeping her voice level despite the rage building behind her ribs. Not divine punishment. If you want people to stop dying, we need you to leave. Thorstein, the Gothi, emerged from the shadows near the high seat. He was ancient, spine curved like a fishing hook, but his voice still carried the weight of spiritual authority. Pack your things, be gone by dawn. Perhaps your departure will appease. She stays. Every head turned toward the entrance. Jarl Magnus stood there, gray-bearded and grim-faced, supporting his eldest son Ragnar under one arm. The young man's face glistened with fever sweat, his eyes glazed and unfocused. The Jarl's heir, the settlement's future, reduced to dead weight against his father's shoulder. She stays and she heals, Magnus said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Or would you rather sacrifice my son to your pride, wife? The silence that followed felt dangerous. Yrsa watched emotions war across Gudrun's beautiful face. Hatred, fear, calculation. The hand on her belly pressed tighter, as if she could shield the unborn child from contamination through sheer will. If she touches him, Gudrun said slowly, if her cursed hands touch my stepson, I want it witnessed. I want everyone to see what happens when we allow corruption into our midst. Yrsa's stomach twisted. A trap. This was a trap. If Ragnar lived, they'd claim. He survived despite her interference. If he died, she'd be blamed for murder. But looking at the young man's gray pallor, at the way his chest heaved with each breath, she knew he had perhaps hours left without intervention. I'll do what I can, Yrsa said, moving forward. The crowd parted around her like water around a rock, people pressing themselves against walls to avoid being touched by her shadow. She knelt beside Ragnar as Magnus lowered him onto a bench. Up close, the symptoms were clear: severe dehydration, intestinal inflammation, the body emptying itself from both ends until nothing remained but a husk. She'd seen this before, in other settlements, other outbreaks. Most people survived if treated properly. Most, not all. Boil water, she ordered, not looking up. Lots of it. And bring me honey, salt, and clean cloth. No one drinks from the stream until I say otherwise. Only boiled water. Do you understand? Nobody moved. Now! Magnus roared, and suddenly, everyone scrambled into motion. Yrsa worked through the night. Her hands moved from patient to patient, administering the honey-salt water mixture that would replace what their bodies had lost, cleaning those too weak to clean themselves, checking pulses and breathing patterns. The work was endless, exhausting, and every single person she helped flinched when her fingers touched their skin. Some prayed aloud as she approached, begging the gods for protection. One man actually wept, whether from illness or from having to endure her touch. She couldn't tell. Gudrun watched from the far end of the hall, never moving, never helping, just standing guard over her pregnant belly like Yrsa might somehow curse the unborn child from across the room. Thorstein stood beside her, lips moving in constant prayer, his bony fingers working prayer beads worn smooth from decades of use. Dawn came gray and cold. Yrsa's back ached, her hands were raw from washing in boiled water between patients, and her eyes felt like someone had filled them with sand. But Ragnar still breathed. So did most of the others. 3 more had died during the night, but that was 3 out of 27 afflicted. Without intervention, it would have been 15, maybe 20. She stood swaying slightly and turned to find Magnus watching her. "You've done well," he said quietly. It wasn't gratitude exactly, more like acknowledgement of a tool that had performed its function adequately. "The stream must be diverted," Yrsa said, too tired to soften her words. "And the waste pit moved, or this will happen again. I'll consider it." Which meant he wouldn't. Which meant this would all happen again next season. and she'd be back in this hall, saving lives that despised her for saving them. Yrsa gathered her supplies and walked toward the door. Behind her, she heard Gudrun's voice, sharp and clear. "Burn everything she touched, all of it, the benches, the cloths, everything. I won't have corruption lingering in my hall." Yrsa's hand shook as she pushed out into the morning cold. She made it halfway to her dwelling before her legs gave out. She knelt in the muddy snow, her medicine bag falling beside her, and pressed her palms against her eyes. She was so tired, so desperately, bone-deep tired of fighting to exist in a world that would rather she didn't. Behind her, smoke began rising from the Jarl's hall. They were burning the benches, burning away any evidence that she'd been there, that she'd saved them, erasing her, as always, as soon as her usefulness ended. The ship appeared on the fourth morning after the sickness began to wane, its single sail cutting through the gray water like a knife through flesh. Yrsa saw it from the shore where she'd been collecting kelp, one of the few medicinal resources the settlement hadn't forbidden her from gathering. The vessel was smaller than the usual trade ships, built for speed rather than cargo, its prow carved into the shape of a serpent's head. Swedish design, if she remembered correctly. The kind of ship a wealthy merchant might use for personal travel rather than bulk trading. She watched it navigate the fjord's treacherous currents with practiced ease, whoever commanded it clearly knowing these waters well. The settlement had noticed too. People emerged from longhouses, shading their eyes against the weak winter sun, curiosity temporarily overriding their usual hostility toward strangers. By the time Yrsa returned to Ravnsfjord proper, the ship had docked and its crew was already unloading cargo under Magnus's supervision. Furs, she saw, premium pelts, the kind that commanded high prices in the southern markets. And amber, great chunks of it glowing like captured sunlight even in the overcast day. The ship's owner stood on the dock, and even from a distance, Yrsa could tell he was different from the usual traders who passed through. He moved with an easy confidence, gesturing broadly as he spoke with Magnus, laughing. At something the Jarl said. Tall, broad-shouldered, with hair the color of old copper tied back from his face. Younger than she'd expected for someone commanding such wealth, perhaps 30 winters at most. She kept her distance, moving along the settlement's edge like she always did, trying to remain unnoticed. But her eyes kept drifting back to the stranger, something about his bearing catching her attention in a way she couldn't quite name. Then he turned, mid-conversation, and looked directly at her. Their eyes met across the space of the dock, and Yrsa's breath caught. He didn't look away, didn't make the sign against evil, didn't let his gaze slide off her face the way everyone else did, focusing on a point just past her shoulder rather than seeing her directly. He just looked at her, really looked, like she was a person worth looking at. Then someone jostled him, and the moment broke. Magnus was introducing him to Gudrun, who had emerged from the hall despite her usual reluctance to deal with traders directly. Yrsa forced herself to turn away, to continue toward her dwelling, telling herself that the flutter in her chest was nothing, meant nothing, was just her foolish heart grasping at the smallest scrap of something that wasn't hatred. She was mixing a poultice for Ragnar's continued recovery when the knock came. Nobody knocked on her door. People shouted from outside if they needed her, refusing to get close enough to actually touch her dwelling. The sound of knuckles on wood was so foreign that for a moment Yrsa just stared at the door, uncertain she'd heard correctly. The knock came again, firmer this time. She opened the door to find the copper-haired trader standing there, a slight smile on his face. Up close, she could see his eyes were an unusual gray-green, like the sea before a storm. He wore silver arm rings that marked him as a man of significant wealth, and his cloak was fastened with a brooch so finely worked it must have cost more than her dwelling and everything in it combined. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, his accent marking him as Swedish, though his Norse was flawless. "I'm told you're the healer who saved half the settlement from the recent sickness." Yrsa's throat went dry. She was suddenly painfully aware of her own appearance, her patched dress, her work-roughened hands, the split in her lip that no amount of wishing had ever healed. She wanted to close the door, to hide, to not endure whatever this was going to be. I did my work, she managed. Then perhaps you can help me. He gestured to his left arm, which she now noticed he held slightly stiff. I'm Erik Thorvaldsen, and I've been fighting a wound infection for the better part of a week. The ship's provisions included nothing helpful, and I was told, rather reluctantly I might add, that you're the only healer worth consulting in Ravensfjord. The word only stung, even though she knew it was true. They'd sent him to her because there was literally no one else. Not because she was skilled. Never because she was skilled. Come in, she said, stepping back. He had to duck slightly to enter her small dwelling. Inside, he looked around with open interest, his eyes taking in the dried herbs, the neat rows of clay vessels containing salves and tinctures, the small workspace where she prepared her medicines. His gaze lingered on a particularly complex diagram she'd sketched on a piece of bark, showing the flow of blood through the body, as she understood it. Remarkable, he murmured. Where did you learn to draw like this? I taught myself. The words came out defensive. She busied herself with gathering supplies, avoiding his eyes. Your arm? He unwound the cloth binding, revealing an angry red infection spreading from what had probably started as a simple cut. Not life-threatening yet, but well on its way to becoming so if left untreated. Yrsa felt herself shift into the familiar territory of diagnosis and treatment. The one place where her confidence never wavered. This will hurt, she warned, reaching for her strongest antiseptic mixture. The infection has to be drawn out. I've endured worse, Erik said, but she noticed his jaw tighten as she began cleaning the wound. She worked in silence, aware of how close they were in the small space, aware of his breathing, aware that he was watching her face as she worked, not staring at the deformity, just watching, like he was genuinely interested in what she was doing. They say you predicted the sickness, he said after a while, that you warned them about the water. They didn't listen. Fools often don't. He winced as she applied pressure to drain the infection. In my travels, I've met healers from Constantinople to Kiev. Your work rivals any of theirs, from what I've seen. Yrsa's hands faltered for just a moment. Nobody had ever compared her to anything except monsters and omens, certainly never to respected healers from distant lands. You're kind, she said quietly, not believing it, certain he was mocking her somehow. I'm observant, he corrected. There's a difference. She finished binding his arm with clean cloth soaked in honey and yarrow extract. Change this twice daily. If the redness spreads or you develop fever, find me immediately. Erik flexed his arm experimentally, then nodded, satisfied. He reached for his belt pouch, pulling out a small piece of amber, perfectly smooth and nearly transparent, worth more than she'd earn in a year if she were allowed to charge for her services, which she wasn't. I can't accept that, Yrsa said, stepping back. Payment for services rendered. If anyone sees, then they'll see a healer being compensated for her skill, as is proper everywhere else in the civilized world. His voice was mild, but something in it made her look up, meeting those storm-colored eyes again. Why do they treat you this way? The question, asked so directly, without preamble or pretense, hit her like a physical blow. Her hand moved involuntarily to her lip, that ancient defensive gesture. Because the gods marked me, she whispered. Because I'm cursed. Strange, Erik said, tilting his head slightly, still looking directly at her face without flinching. I see skill, intelligence, and remarkable strength. No curse that I can detect. Then he smiled, placed the amber on her workbench despite her protest, and ducked back out into the cold afternoon, leaving Yrsa standing in her dwelling. With her heart beating so hard she thought it might crack her ribs open from the inside. Erik stayed in Ravensfjord for trade negotiations, or so he told Magnus. But Yrsa saw him everywhere she went, watching her with those storm-gray eyes, and she began to suspect trade had nothing to do with it. He appeared at the well when she drew water in the early morning, greeting her with a warmth that made the other women clutch their buckets tighter and hurry away. He asked her questions about the local
Slutat tro på för länge sedan.
Bakom henne, gömd bland träden där snön föll tystare än dödängels, stod Dalla och såg allt. Another replied, seeing if she'll curse him. Everyone knows foreigners don't understand our ways. My husband says it's unnatural. Says Eric must be mocking her, playing some Swedish game we don't understand. Each word landed like a stone. Yrsa kept her head down, kept walking, kept pretending she didn't hear. But at night, alone in her dwelling, the whispers echoed in her skull until she wanted to scream. On the 5th day of Eric's stay, he found her at the forest's edge, gathering birch bark for fever remedies. The snow had deepened overnight, making each step an effort, but Yrsa welcomed the solitude of the woods. Here, at least, there were no eyes to judge her, no mouths to spit curses. You're avoiding me, Eric said, appearing between the trees with the quiet grace of a hunting cat. Yrsa's knife slipped, cutting into the bark too deep. She cursed under her breath. You shouldn't be here. Why not? Because... She turned to face him, frustration finally overwhelming. Caution. Because every time you speak to me, they hate me more. Every time you treat me like I'm not a monster, they find new ways to remind me that I am. Eric's expression shifted, something darker moving behind his eyes. What have they done? Nothing new. Her laugh came out bitter. Just the usual. Yesterday, someone left a dead crow on my doorstep. 2 days ago, Torvald and his friends threw rocks again. This morning, I found all my drying herbs torn down and trampled. Small things. Constant things. Small? Eric's voice went cold in a way that made her look up sharply. Those aren't small things, Yrsa. Those are cruelties. They're my life. She said simply. They've always been my life. He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her want to hide. Then he said, very softly, come with me. What? Leave this place. Come to Sweden. I know healers there who would welcome your knowledge, who would teach you things you've only guessed at. You could have a real life, not this. He gestured back toward the settlement, disgust plain on his features. Not this slow torture. Yrsa's heart lurched. For one dizzying moment, she let herself imagine it. Leaving Ravensfjord, leaving the hatred, starting fresh somewhere. People didn't know her face, didn't have 24 years of prejudice already carved into their minds. Learning from other healers, being seen as something other than cursed. Then reality crashed back. I can't, she, whispered. Why not? Because... How could she explain it? The fear that ran so deep it had become part of her bones. Because this is the only place I know. Because what if I get there and it's the same? What if the curse is real, Eric, and I carry it with me wherever I go? There is no curse. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of darker gray in his eyes, smell the scent of pine and leather that clung to his cloak. There's just a woman of extraordinary skill, trapped in a settlement full of small, frightened people who need someone to blame for their own failures. You don't understand, Yrsa said, her voice breaking. You can't understand. You walk through the world and people smile at you. They welcome you. They treat you like you matter. I've never had that. Not once. Not ever. And the thought of hoping for it, of believing it could be different, terrifies me more than staying here does. Something in her words seemed to pain him. His hand lifted, hesitated, then gently touched her shoulder. The first kind touch she could remember receiving in years. Yrsa's entire body went rigid. You're shaking, Eric said quietly. She was. She hadn't even noticed. Her hands trembled where they gripped the basket of bark, her breath coming in short gasps. The warmth of his hand on her shoulder felt like it might burn straight through her cloak, through her skin, down to the hollow place inside her that had learned long ago not to want kindness. Because wanting only made the lack of it hurt more. I should go back, she managed. Yrsa, please. She pulled away from his touch, from the dangerous possibility he represented. Please just let me go back. She fled through the snow, her basket banging against her hip, tears freezing on her cheeks before she could wipe them away. Behind her, she heard Eric call her name once, But she didn't stop, couldn't stop, because if she stopped, she might turn around, and that terrified her most of all. She made it to her dwelling and barred the door, then sank down with her back against it, finally letting the sobs come. Great, wrenching things that tore out of her chest like they'd been waiting years to escape, because Eric was right. She knew he was right. This wasn't life, it was survival. And there was a difference. But survival was familiar. Survival, she understood. The alternative, the possibility of something more, something better, felt like standing at the edge of a cliff with no way to know if the water below was deep enough to survive the fall. That night, Yrsa lay awake listening to voices drift from the Jarl's hall. Eric was in there, sharing mead and stories with Magnus and the other men. She heard laughter, the kind of easy camaraderie she'd never known. Then she heard her name, spoken loud enough to carry through the cold air. The healer. Magnus's voice, gruff with drink. What about her? I've offered to take her to Sweden. Eric's response was steady, sober. She's wasted here. A long pause. Then Gudrun's voice, sharp as a blade. Take the cursed thing. Good riddance. Perhaps without her poisoning our settlement, the gods will bless us again. More voices joined in, agreeing, suggesting, encouraging. They wanted her gone, had always wanted her gone. Eric's offer wasn't an insult to them, it was an answer to prayers they'd been too cowardly to voice. Yrsa pressed her hands over her ears, but she could still hear them, celebrating the possibility of her absence, treating her departure like a festival gift. And somewhere in the darkness, curled up alone, she began to wonder if maybe being wanted nowhere was worse than being wanted, even if that want came from cruelty rather than love. The fever came to Gudrun 3 days before Eric planned to leave. Yrsa was grinding willow bark in her dwelling when she heard the commotion, voices raised in panic from the Jarl's hall. She set down her mortar and listened, that familiar dread settling in her stomach like a stone. When footsteps approached her door, running, stumbling through snow, she already knew what they'd say. Magnus himself stood in her doorway, gray-faced and breathing hard. It's Gudrun, the fever, like before, but worse. She's... His voice cracked. She's with child. You have to come. Yrsa grabbed her medicine bag without a word. They moved through the settlement together, Magnus half running despite his age. And everywhere Yrsa looked, she saw faces in doorways, watching. No. One offered help. No one moved to assist. They just watched, waiting to see what would happen when the cursed woman touched the Jarl's pregnant wife. Inside the hall, chaos reigned. Women clustered around Gudrun's sleeping bench, their voices a panicked chorus of prayers and useless suggestions. Thorstein stood at the far end, chanting something that might have been protective verses or might have been gibberish. Yrsa couldn't tell through the noise. Then the women saw her, and the hall went silent. Gudrun lay on the bench, her face flushed with fever, her pregnant belly rising and falling with labored breaths. Even unconscious, even burning with sickness, she was beautiful. Golden hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, perfect features twisted in discomfort. Everything Yrsa had never been, would never be. Get back, one of the women hissed as Yrsa approached. Don't let her touch. Move, Magnus commanded, and they scattered like startled birds. Yrsa knelt beside the bench, her hands already assessing. High fever, yes, but also premature contractions rippling across Gudrun's swollen stomach. The baby was trying to come, pushed into early labor by the mother's body trying to fight the infection. Too early. At least a month too early, maybe more. She's in labor, Yrsa said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. The baby's coming. Can you stop it? Magnus demanded. Yrsa met his eyes. I can try, but if I can't, if the baby comes now, it might not survive. And if the fever doesn't break, Gudrun might not either. Someone behind her made a sound, half sob, half prayer. Yrsa recognized the voice of Astrid, Gudrun's closest friend, the same woman who'd once convinced her children to throw mud at Yrsa's dwelling. Then save her, Magnus said, whatever it takes. Yrsa worked through the afternoon and into the evening, fighting battles on two fronts. She packed Gudrun in snow to lower the fever, forced medicine between her clenched teeth, pressed specific points on her belly to ease the contractions. Ancient knowledge, learned from observations, from trial and error, from 24 years of being allowed to practice on the desperate because nobody else would try. Eric appeared at some point, standing near the entrance. Yrsa felt his presence like a physical thing, a warmth at her back, but she didn't turn, didn't acknowledge him. All her focus stayed on Gudrun, on keeping this woman alive even though this woman had made her life a walking nightmare. "Why are you helping her?" Astrid's voice, quiet and confused, from somewhere behind Yrsa. "After everything she's done to you, why do you even care?" Yrsa's hands paused for just a moment on Gudrun's fevered skin. "Because I'm a healer," she said simply. "That's what healers do." Night fell. The contractions eased. The fever began, slowly, grudgingly, to break. Gudrun's breathing deepened, steadied, slipped from the harsh gasps of crisis into the regular rhythm of exhausted sleep. The baby stayed where it was, safe for now in its mother's womb. Yrsa sat back on her heels, every muscle in her body screaming with fatigue. Around her, the women of Ravensfjord stared at her with expressions she couldn't read. Not gratitude exactly, something more complicated, something that might have been shame. "She'll live," Yrsa said to Magnus. "Keep her warm, keep her drinking water with honey. The baby should be fine if she rests properly for the next month." Magnus nodded slowly. He opened his mouth to say something, closed it, then finally managed, "You've done well." The same words he'd spoken after the last sickness. Not thanks, just acknowledgement, as if she were a tool that had performed adequately. Yrsa gathered her supplies and stood, swaying with exhaustion. She made it 3 steps toward the door before Gudrun's voice stopped her. "Wait." Everyone turned. Gudrun had woken, was struggling to sit up despite Astrid's attempts to keep her down. Her eyes found Yrsa, and, for the first time in all the years they'd lived in the same settlement, Gudrun looked directly at her face without flinching away. "You saved us," Gudrun said. Her voice was hoarse, weak, but clear. "Both of us, my baby and me." Yrsa said nothing, didn't trust herself to speak. Her throat felt like it was closing. "I've been..." Gudrun stopped, swallowed hard. "I've been cruel to you. We've all been cruel. And you still saved me." The hall was so quiet Yrsa could hear the fire crackling, hear the, wind outside, hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She wanted to say something gracious, something that would ease the tension, but all she could think about was the dead crow on her doorstep, the rocks hitting her back, the years of isolation and hatred and being made to feel less than human. "I did my work," Yrsa said finally, the same words she always said. "That's all." She walked out into the night, into the snow and cold and darkness, and this time nobody tried to stop her. Behind her, the hall erupted in conversation, voices rising and falling, but she didn't look back, didn't slow down, just kept walking until she reached her dwelling and could finally be alone. Except she wasn't alone. Eric stood near her door, waiting, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. "You didn't have to save her," he said quietly. "After everything she's done to you, nobody would have blamed you if you'd walked away. I would have blamed me." Yrsa fumbled with her door, her hands shaking so badly she could barely lift the latch. "I'm not like them. I can't be like them. If I let hatred make me cruel, then they win. Then everything they've ever said about me being cursed, being less than human, becomes true." The door opened and she stumbled inside, dropping her medicine bag, pressing her palms against her eyes. She heard Eric follow her in, heard the door close, heard him moving closer. "You're the strongest person I've ever met," he said. "And I've traveled from the shores of England to the walls of Constantinople. I've met jarls and kings and warriors whose names echo in sagas. Not one of them has your strength. I don't feel strong." The words came out broken. "I feel tired, Eric. So tired of fighting just to exist." His hand touched her shoulder again, gentle as it had been in the forest. This time Yrsa didn't pull away, didn't have the energy to pull away. She let herself lean back, just slightly, let herself feel the solid warmth of another human being who didn't recoil from her touch. "Come with me," Eric said again. "Please, let me show you what life could be like without all of this." And for the first time, standing in her small dwelling with his hand on her shoulder and her defenses crumbling from exhaustion, Yrsa let herself truly consider it. The morning Eric was set to depart, Ramsfjord woke to find Yrsa's dwelling empty. She'd packed in darkness, taking only what could fit in a single leather sack, her tools, her most precious medicines, the piece of amber Eric had given her. Everything else, the dried herbs and careful diagrams and clay vessels she'd spent years collecting, she left behind. Let them burn it all, like they'd burned the benches she'd touched. Let them erase every trace of her. She was done being erased while still breathing. Yrsa stood on the dock as Eric's crew loaded the last of the trade goods, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack through her ribs. The settlement was stirring now. Smoke rising from longhouses, voices carrying across the cold morning air. Any moment someone would see her, would realize what she was doing, and then what? They'd celebrate. They'd cheer. They'd thank the gods for ridding them of their convenient scapegoat. "Ready?" Eric appeared beside her, his storm-gray eyes searching her face. Yrsa nodded, not trusting her voice. Her hands gripped her sack so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "Leaving without saying goodbye?" The voice came from behind them. Gudrun stood at the dock's edge, wrapped in furs against the morning cold, one hand pressed protectively against her belly. Her face was pale, still recovering, but her eyes were sharp and clear. Yrsa's stomach dropped. Here it came. The final cruelty, the parting curse to send her off with. "I didn't think anyone would want a goodbye," Yrsa said quietly. Gudrun was silent for a long moment, her gaze moving from Yrsa to Eric and back again. Then she reached into her cloak and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. She held it out. "For your journey," Gudrun said. Yrsa took it with trembling hands, unwrapped it. Inside was a silver brooch, beautifully worked, worth more than everything Yrsa had ever owned combined. The kind of jewelry a Jarl's wife wore to important gatherings. "I can't. You saved my life," Gudrun interrupted. "You saved my child's life. And before that, you saved Ragnar, saved half the settlement, saved people who treated you worse than thralls." Her voice cracked slightly. "I can't give you back the years we took from you. I can't undo the cruelty. But I can give you this, and I can tell you that you deserved better than what we gave you." Yrsa stared at the brooch, at the silver gleaming in the weak morning light, and felt something break inside her chest. Not break like shattering, but break like a dam giving way, releasing years of held-back tears. "I hated you," Yrsa whispered. "There were nights I lay awake hating all of you so much I thought it would consume me." "I know," Gudrun said simply. "We gave you every reason to." More people were emerging now, drawn by the commotion. Magnus appeared, then Ragnar, then others, clustering at the dock's edge. Yrsa waited for the jeers, the mockery, the final insults. But they came with strange expressions, uncomfortable and uncertain, like people who'd just realized they'd been doing something wrong but weren't sure how to stop. "You're leaving us," Magnus said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. We'll have no healer." "Then perhaps you should have treated your healer better." Eric's voice was cold, harder than Yrsa had ever heard it. His hand moved to her elbow, protective. "Perhaps you should have valued her before she was forced to seek value elsewhere." Magnus's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Couldn't argue. The truth of Eric's words hung in the air like smoke. Thorstein pushed through the crowd, his ancient face creased with what might have been regret. "The god's mark. People for many reasons," he said, his voice carrying. "I was wrong to assume the mark on your face was a curse. I was wrong about many things. Your wrongness almost killed me," Yrsa said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "It killed something in me anyway. The part that believed I deserved kindness. The part that thought I might belong somewhere." "You belonged here," a small voice said. Yrsa turned to find Torvald standing at the crowd's edge, the boy who'd thrown rocks at her, who'd called her crooked mouth and cursed thing. His face was red, tears tracking down his cheeks. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," my father said. "He said you were evil, and I believed him, and I'm sorry." Yrsa looked at this child, this boy who'd caused her pain, and felt the hatred she'd been carrying begin to loosen its grip. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever, but something softer than the burning rage she'd nursed in her darkest moments. "Your father was wrong," she said, "and you were young, but you're old enough now to choose differently than he did. Remember that." Eric's crew called that they were ready. The tide was turning, the wind shifting in their favor. If they were going to leave, it had to be now. Yrsa turned toward the ship, then stopped, turned back one last time to look at Ravensfjord, at the settlement that had been her prison for 24 years, the longhouses and the smoke and the faces of people who'd made her feel less than human. "I hope you learn," she said, her voice carrying across the dock. "I hope you learn to see people for what they offer, not for what they look like. I hope you learn kindness, because the next person you decide to hate might not be as strong as I was forced to become. They might break under the weight of your cruelty, and that blood will be on your hands, not theirs." The silence that followed felt heavy, significant. Then Yrsa climbed aboard Eric's ship, her legs shaking, her heart racing, every instinct screaming at her to run back to the familiar hell of Ravensfjord, rather than face the unknown ahead. But Eric's hand found hers as the crew pushed off from the dock, his fingers warm and solid and real. The ship began to move, catching the current, the settlement growing smaller behind them. "Are you all right?" Eric asked quietly. Yrsa watched Ravensfjord recede, watched the people on the dock become tiny figures, then dots, then nothing at all. She was leaving behind everything she'd ever known. Every landmark, every face, every piece of familiarity that had anchored her existence, and she felt terrified, and she felt free. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Ask me again when we reach Sweden." Eric smiled, and for the first time in her entire life, Yrsa smiled back without hiding her mouth, without turning her face away, without shame. The wind caught her hair, salt spray misted her face, and the ship carried her toward a future she couldn't imagine. Behind them, on the dock, Gudrun watched, until the ship disappeared around the fjord's bend. Then she touched the place where her unborn child grew, and whispered a prayer. Not to the gods, but to the woman who'd saved them both despite every reason not to. A prayer that Yrsa would find what she'd been denied her entire life. A place where she was wanted not despite her scars, but including them. A place where she could finally rest. The storm hit 3 days into the journey, turning the sea into a churning mass of gray. Violence that seemed determined to swallow them whole. Yrsa clung to the side of the ship, her fingers white-knuckled around the rope Eric's crew had tied there for stability, watching waves taller than longhouses rise and crash against the hull. Water poured across the deck in sheets, soaking through her cloak, her dress, straight through to her skin, until she couldn't remember what dry felt like. Eric worked alongside his crew, his voice carrying commands through the howling wind, and Yrsa saw a different man than the merchant who'd walked through Ravensfjord with easy confidence. This was a sailor, a warrior against the sea itself, every movement purposeful and sure even as the ship pitched and rolled beneath them. One of the crew, a young man named Doug, slipped on the wet deck and slammed hard against the mast. The crack of bone was audible even over the storm. He went down with a scream that cut off into gasping sobs. "Below deck!" Eric shouted at Yrsa. "Get him below!" She moved. Without thinking, years of responding to crisis overriding her terror. 2 other crew members helped drag Doug down the narrow ladder into the ship's belly, where cargo and supplies rolled with each wave. The space was dark, cramped, smelling of salt and wet wood and fear. Yrsa's medicine bag had stayed tied to her waist through the chaos. She fumbled it open with shaking hands, trying to assess Doug's injury in the dim light filtering through gaps in the deck above. His arm bent at an angle that made her stomach clench. Broken, badly, possibly in multiple places. "This will hurt," she said, the same words she'd spoken hundreds of times before, and set about straightening the bone. Dogs screamed. The sound echoed in the confined space, mixing with the roar of the storm outside. Yrsa worked quickly, efficiently, splinting the arm with pieces of wood she pried from a supply crate, binding it tight with strips torn from her own cloak since she had no clean cloth. The ship lurched violently. Yrsa fell against the hull, her head cracking against wood. Stars exploded behind her eyes. She tasted blood, felt warmth trickling down her temple, but forced herself upright again. Dog's arm needed to stay immobilized or the bone would shift, would heal wrong, would cripple him. "Hold him," she ordered the other crew members, and they obeyed without hesitation, without looking at her face with disgust, without questioning whether the cursed woman's touch would make things worse. Because here, in the belly of a ship fighting for survival in a storm that might kill them all, nobody cared about her deformed lip. They cared only that she knew what to do when bones broke and blood flowed. The storm raged for 2 days. Yrsa stayed below deck with Dog, monitoring his injury, forcing water between his lips when he could drink, cleaning the wound where bone had broken through skin. The crew rotated through, collapsing into exhausted sleep when they could, then dragging themselves back up to fight the sea again. Eric came down once in a brief lull between waves. His eyes found her immediately in the darkness, checking, assessing. Blood still crusted her temple from where she'd hit her head. "You're hurt," he said, moving toward her. "I'm fine. It's nothing." "Let me—" "Eric." She caught his hand, stopped him. "I've spent my entire life taking care of others. Let me do what I'm good at. Please." He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "When this is over," he said, quietly, "you're going to learn what it feels like to be cared for. I promise you that." Then he was gone again, back up into the screaming wind and salt spray, and Yrsa was left with his words echoing in her head, feeling like something precious and fragile and terrifying. On the morning of the 3rd day, the storm broke. Yrsa climbed on deck to find the world transformed. The sea had gone calm, smooth as polished glass, reflecting a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting everything gold and rose, and the air tasted clean and new like the world had been scrubbed fresh. The crew moved slowly, exhausted but alive, checking the ship for damage. The sail was torn in places, some cargo had been lost, but they'd survived. They'd actually survived. Eric stood at the prow, his copper hair matted with salt, his face drawn with fatigue. When he saw Yrsa emerge, something in his expression shifted, softened. He crossed the deck to her. "Dog?" he asked. "He'll live. The arm will heal, though he'll probably have limited mobility. He needs to rest it for at least 6 weeks. You saved him. I did my work." The familiar response, automatic after so many years. "No." Eric's voice was firm. "You saved him. You stayed with him through a storm that had grown men praying to every god they knew. You set his bone in the dark, in a ship being thrown around like driftwood, while injured yourself. You saved him, Yrsa. Accept it." The words hit her. Differently than Magnus's grudging acknowledgments had. Hit her somewhere deep and vulnerable that she'd protected for so long she'd almost forgotten it existed. "I don't know how," she admitted quietly. "I don't know how to accept praise. I've only ever known how to deflect it, minimize it, make myself smaller so they'd hurt me less." Eric's hand came up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently touched the dried blood at her temple. "Then you'll learn," he said. "The same way you learned healing. Through practice and patience and being around people who actually see your worth." Land appeared on the horizon an hour later. Sweden. Eric's home. The place where Yrsa was supposed to start her new life, whatever that meant. As they drew closer, she could see a settlement much larger than Ravensfjord, with proper docks and multiple ships and buildings that spoke of wealth and permanence. People moved along the shore, and Yrsa's stomach knotted with familiar dread. New people meant new judgments, new stares, new opportunities to be found lacking. "They're going to look at me," she said, more to herself than to Eric. "Yes," he agreed. "They will. They're going to see what I see." Eric interrupted gently. "A brilliant healer who saved my crew member's life during a storm. A woman of extraordinary courage who left everything familiar to start over somewhere new. Someone worth knowing. And if they don't see that?" Yrsa's voice came out small, frightened. "What if I traded one hell for another?" Eric was quiet for a moment, watching the settlement grow larger as they approached. Then he said, "Then we'll leave. We'll find somewhere else. We'll keep looking until we find a place where people aren't blind to what's right in front of them." He looked at her then, his storm gray eyes intense. "I didn't bring you here to suffer differently, Yrsa. I brought you here to live, and if this isn't the right place, we'll find the one that is." The ship glided toward the dock. People gathered to greet them, calling out welcome, asking about the trade journey. Yrsa saw faces turn toward her, saw curiosity and interest and the beginning of questions. But she also saw Eric step closer, a subtle shield, his presence saying without words that she was under his protection. Saw his crew members, battered and exhausted from the storm, nod to her with respect. Saw Doug, his arm splinted and bound, smile at her despite his pain. And for the first time in her entire life, Yrsa stepped onto shore, not as the cursed woman, not as the necessary evil, not as the monster to be tolerated, but as the healer who'd saved lives in a storm, as someone who mattered, as someone who belonged. 6 months after leaving Ravensfjord, Yrsa stood in the doorway of her own healing house, watching the spring sun paint the Swedish settlement gold, and didn't recognize the woman she'd become. The building Eric had helped her establish sat near the center of town, not hidden at the edges like her dwelling in Ravensfjord had been. People passed by constantly, and most of them greeted her. Some even stopped to talk, to ask her opinion on matters that had nothing to do with illness or injury, as if her thoughts on everyday things mattered, as if she were simply another person living among them. Inside, shelves lined the walls, filled with medicines and tools far beyond what she'd had access to in Norway. Eric had introduced her to other healers, merchants who traded in rare herbs, scholars who'd studied in distant lands. She'd learned techniques she'd only guessed at, confirmed theories she'd developed alone, discovered that her instincts had been right more often than not. But the strangest thing, the thing that still caught her off guard every single day, was the apprentice. Astrid was 16, bright-eyed and quick-handed, the daughter of a local farmer who'd shown an interest in healing. She'd been coming to Yrsa for 3 months now, learning to identify herbs, prepare medicines, read the signs of illness before it became crisis. And she looked at Yrsa with something that resembled admiration. "Is this the correct ratio?" Astrid asked now, holding up a mixture she'd been preparing for fever reduction. Yrsa examined it, nodded approval. "Perfect. You're learning quickly." The girl beamed, and Yrsa felt that familiar flutter in her chest. The one that said, "This isn't real. This can't last. You don't deserve this." The voice from Ravensfjord, still echoing even here, but quieter now. Every day, a little quieter. Eric appeared in the doorway, and despite 6 months of seeing him regularly, Yrsa's heart still did something complicated in her chest. He'd been patient, giving her space to adjust, to learn how to exist without constant fear. But his intentions had never been unclear. He wanted more than friendship, more than the mentorship he'd offered that first day in Ravensfjord. And terrifyingly, Yrsa was beginning to want that too. "There's someone here to see you," Eric said, his expression carefully neutral in a way that made Yrsa's stomach clench. "From Norway." Gudrun stood in the main square, looking out of place in her fine furs and jewelry, her belly no longer swollen but her arms holding a bundle wrapped in soft wool. The baby. She'd carried the baby to term, had given birth successfully, and now stood in a foreign settlement holding the child Yrsa had saved. Yrsa approached slowly, her apprentice and Eric following at a respectful distance. Gudrun turned, and Yrsa saw exhaustion in her face, the kind that came from long travel and new motherhood both. I didn't think I'd see you again, Yrsa said. I had to come. Gudrun shifted the baby in her arms. I had to show you, had to let you see what you saved. She pulled back the wool, revealing a tiny face, perfect and peaceful in sleep. A girl, Yrsa saw, with wisps of blonde hair and her mother's delicate features. She's beautiful, Yrsa said, and meant it, though the words came out rougher than intended. Her name is Yrsa. The world seemed to tilt. Yrsa stared at Gudrun, certain she'd misheard, but the other woman's eyes were steady and sure. You named your daughter after me? After the woman who saved both our lives, yes? Gudrun's voice was quiet but firm. After the woman whose strength I want my daughter to have, whose courage, whose capacity for kindness even when the world is cruel. Yrsa's eyes burned. She blinked hard, refusing to cry in the middle of the settlement square, but the tears came anyway, hot and fast and impossible to stop. I hated you, she whispered. There were nights I wished you dead, wished all of you dead. I know. Gudrun stepped closer. I deserved that hatred. We all did. What we did to you was unforgivable. She paused, adjusting the baby in her arms. But you forgave us anyway. Not with words, but with actions. You saved me when you could have let me die. You saved all of us, over and over, no matter how we treated you. I didn't do it for forgiveness. I know that too. Gudrun smiled, sad and knowing. You did it because you're a healer, because you can't help but see the humanity in people even when they refuse to see it in you. That's why you're stronger than any warrior I've ever known. The baby stirred, making small noises. Gudrun glanced down, then back at Yrsa. Would you like to hold her? Yrsa's breath caught. I've never... Please, Gudrun said, softly. Please hold my daughter. Let me give you this at least. Let me show you that you were never the monster we made you believe you were. With trembling hands, Yrsa took the baby. The weight was nothing, lighter than her medicine bag, but somehow more significant than anything she'd ever held. Little Yrsa opened her eyes, unfocused and wondering, and looked up at the woman she was named for, and Yrsa broke. 24 years of held-back tears, of swallowed pain, of forcing herself to be stronger than anyone should have to be, came pouring out in great, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. She held the baby carefully, protectively, even as she cried, and Gudrun's hand came to rest on her shoulder, offering comfort without words. Eric was there too suddenly, his presence solid and warm, and Astrid, her young apprentice, who looked stricken at seeing her teacher fall apart. But Yrsa couldn't stop, couldn't hold it back anymore, could only stand in the Swedish spring sunlight, holding a baby named after her, and finally grieve for everything she'd lost and everything she'd survived. You're safe now, Gudrun whispered. You're safe and you're valued, and you never have to go back to being small again. Do you hear me, Yrsa? Never again. The words wrapped around her like a blanket, like armor, like the protection she'd never had and had learned to live without but had desperately, achingly needed all along. Later, after Gudrun had left to find lodging for the night, after Astrid had gone home, Yrsa sat with Eric in the healing house, watching the sun set through the window. The light painted everything rose and gold, soft and warm and nothing like the harsh gray of Ravensfjord. She named her daughter after you, Eric said quietly. I know. Yrsa still couldn't quite believe it. A Jarl's daughter, carrying my name. In Ravensfjord, they would have seen that as a curse. And here they'll see it as an honor. The realization felt strange on her. Tongue, foreign but increasingly familiar. Here I'm not the cursed woman, I'm just Yrsa, the healer. Eric's hand found hers, warm and solid and real. Here you're Yrsa, the brilliant healer. Yrsa, the woman who saved lives in a storm. Yrsa, the teacher who's training the next generation. Yrsa, who deserves every good thing this world has to offer. She turned to look at him, this man who'd seen value in her when her own people saw only corruption. I'm still learning how to believe that. No, he said and smiled, but you have time. You have all the time in the world now. No more running, no more hiding. Just living. Living, not surviving. The difference between the two had seemed academic once, meaningless. But now Yrsa understood it in her bones. Survival was enduring each day. Living was having reasons to want tomorrow. She had reasons now. Her healing house, her apprentice, the respect of people who saw her skill before they saw her scars, and Eric, patient and steady, waiting for her to be ready for everything he offered. "Ask me again," Yrsa said suddenly. "Ask you what?" "What you asked me in Ravensfjord. About the future. Ask me again." Eric's eyes widened slightly, understanding dawning. "Build a life with me," he said, his voice low and intent. "Not because you're escaping something, but because you're choosing something. Choose this. Choose us. Choose the life you deserve." Yrsa thought of Ravensfjord, of the years of hatred and isolation and being made to feel less than human. Thought of the voyage across the sea, of the storm that had tested her, of stepping onto Swedish soil terrified and uncertain. Thought of every patient she'd healed here, every person who'd greeted her with respect, every moment she'd been allowed to simply exist without justifying her existence. Thought of a baby named Yrsa, carrying her name into the future like a banner instead of a burden. "Yes," she said, and the word felt like freedom. "Yes, I choose this. I choose all of it." Eric's smile was brighter than the setting sun. He raised her hand to his lips, kissed her scarred knuckles, her work-roughened fingers, held her hand against his cheek like it was something precious. And Yrsa, who had spent 24 years being told she was cursed, finally understood what it meant to be blessed. Yrsa's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. How often do we judge worth by appearance rather than character? How many brilliant souls have we dismissed because they didn't fit our narrow definition of acceptable? She spent 24 years saving the people who despised her, choosing compassion over revenge even when hatred would have been justified. Ask yourself honestly, if you had her skill, her power over life and death, and faced the same years of cruelty, what would you have done when the Jarl's wife lay dying? Would you have been strong enough to heal the woman who made your existence torture? Or would you have walked away and let nature take its course? The most devastating part of Yrsa's journey isn't the cruelty she endured. It's how long she believed she deserved it. How many of us carry scars, visible or invisible, that make us feel less than human? How many of us have internalized the hatred others projected onto us? Yrsa's true strength wasn't in her healing hands. It was in her refusal to let their poison turn her into the monster they claimed she was. She chose humanity when the world chose cruelty. She chose forgiveness when revenge would have been easier. And in doing so, she didn't just save lives, she reclaimed her own. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about the people we dismiss and the judgments we make, please share it. Stories like Yrsa's need to be told, need to remind us that worth isn't determined by the face we're born with, but by the choices we make with the life we're given. Hit that like button, subscribe to see more stories that challenge how we see the world, and leave a comment telling us what you would have done in Yrsa's place. Because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply ask ourselves, am I seeing people, or am I seeing only what I've been taught to see?